Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be comparing each adaptation of Frank Herbert's novel Dune. Before we begin, I do have a review for the source material if you're interested in checking that out first. And the adaptations that I'm going to be focusing on go as follows. The 1984 David Lynch film, the 2000 TV miniseries, and the 2021 Denis Villeneuve film, which covers the first half of the book. Which means I'm not going to be covering Children of Dune, which is a follow-up to the 2000 miniseries. You know, it wasn't adapted from Dune, but rather two of its sequels, that being Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. So maybe I'll cover that in the future, who knows. And I'm not going to be discussing these adaptations as standalone films, but instead I'm simply going to be comparing them to the source material, and talking about what I liked and disliked about them. So, with all of that out the way, let's begin. So the very first adaptation of Dune is of course the David Lynch movie, released in 1984. It was released to largely negative reviews and poor box office numbers, and ultimately it was deemed a failure. David Lynch has since disowned the film, mainly due to the frequent clashes between him and Universal Studios at the time, to the point where he was even denied Final Cut privilege.
When you don't have Final Cut, total creative freedom, you stand to die the death. And died I did.
And asked to be credited as Alan Smithy, which is a pseudonym used by directors who wish to disown something they created. Behind the scenes, the very first rough cut that Lynch assembled came to about 4 hours, though he claimed he intended to trim it down to at least 3. But the producers came a-knocking and demanded he cut it down to 2. Thus resulting in the finished product that ended up in theaters. The film has gained a cult following over the years, especially among casual viewers who were probably unfamiliar with the source material at the time. However, to this day, the film still remains divisive within the Dune community. Now, with all of that in mind, what did I think of this particular adaptation of Dune? Well, to be honest, I think it's just okay. I don't love it, but I don't hate it either. Though I would consider it to be a guilty pleasure of mine, you know? I'd have no problem just turning it on and watching it any time during the day. It has a certain charm to it, being a product of 80s science fiction, but as an adaptation of such a legendary book, it is heavily flawed in my opinion. So when it comes to the stuff I liked, there's actually quite a bit. You know, I think this movie has a stellar cast behind it. We've got Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides, and I think he did a terrific job despite being too old for the role. And some other big names as well, like Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck, Virginia Madsen as Princess Irulan, Jürgen Prochnow as Duke Leto, Max von Sydow as Dr. Kynes, Sean Young as Chani, Sting got to play Feyd-Rautha, and even Brad Dourif as Piter de Vries. Production-wise, this movie is beautiful and holds up very, very well. You know, I love everything from the costumes to the set designs to the on-set filming for the outskirts of Arrakis. Even the visual effects are pretty good for their time as well. And who could forget the iconic soundtrack composed by Toto and Brian Eno? This soundtrack really stood out for its use of gothic synth organs, tribal percussions, Middle Eastern melodies, and of course, elements of Toto's signature progressive rock sound. Because this is a David Lynch film, it wasn't afraid to get surreal in places. You know, David Lynch is known for having a surrealistic style, and you may not get to see it in its full capacity here, but it's done pretty well, and it only adds to this film's unique atmosphere. And above all else, despite its many flaws, it did get a couple of core elements right when it comes to adapting the source material. However, this adaptation has problems aplenty. First of all, it's impossible to tell this story in just over 2 hours, but the producers ended up pressuring David Lynch to do precisely that. As a result, major plot elements and characterization ended up being cut from the film altogether, thus resulting in a disjointed and unevenly paced mess. You know, the first half is pretty slow, and then the second half is kind of rushed. Some of the film's creative liberties were also questionable at best. You know, Paul is an adult instead of a kid. There's a lot of expository voiceovers spoken by the characters. You know, it's a nifty storytelling trick, but the film relies too much on it. And one aspect of the film's ending did not make a lick of sense at all. While the acting was good for the most part, it tended to be a bit hammy in spots, especially from the actors portraying the Harkonnens, and despite all of the effort put into the film's production values, I've always found the set designs for House Harkonnen to be somewhat cheap looking. I get what they were going for, but to me it felt somewhat phoned in, or maybe they just ran out of money. Now when you factor all of this in, I think the ideal means of adapting the book would have either been 2 films, like what Denis Villeneuve has done recently, or 1 3-hour movie. Speaking of which, a roughly 3-hour cut does actually exist and has aired on television. It adds a bit more context to the story, it restores missing scenes, and fleshes out the characters a bit more. However, if you choose to watch this version instead, it's going to be very exhausting due to its runtime and heavy exposition. And it's only a slight improvement over the theatrical cut in my opinion. So overall, not a bad adaptation. You know, I think there was a lot of potential here had the studio not intervened. So I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. Next up is Frank Herbert's Dune, the 2000 miniseries. It was produced by the Sci-Fi Channel and directed by John Harrison. It comprised of 3 episodes and ran for a whopping 265 minutes, which is about 4 hours and 25 minutes, with each episode being approximately 90 minutes in length. It was produced on a budget of $20 million, which is about half of what the David Lynch film cost. And when it comes to the general consensus on this particular adaptation, it appears to be weirdly mixed. Some consider it to be an improvement over the David Lynch film, some say it's the definitive adaptation of Dune. And of course, some people find it to be the weakest of all the adaptations. And that so happens to include me as well. Now, I don't think it's terrible, but just like the David Lynch film, I just find it to be okay. It's better than the David Lynch film in some ways, but it's also worse in others. I think if you go into this without having read the book or having seen the David Lynch film, you might enjoy this more than I did. So looking at what I liked about this miniseries, firstly, it's more faithful to the source material. You know, it includes content that never made it into the David Lynch film, and it even ditches some of the creative liberties from that film that I wasn't a big fan of. It also wasn't afraid to take some creative risks of its own, like giving Princess Irulan a more prominent role compared to the source material. There were also some really good casting choices here, especially for a made-for-TV production. I thought Alec Newman was a pretty good choice to play Paul Atreides. And there are some other recognizable cast members, such as Ian McNeice, who plays the Baron, and of course Duke Leto is played by the late great William Hurt, may he rest in peace. The score for this miniseries was composed by Graham Revell, and has a couple of things in common with Toto's soundtrack for the David Lynch film, such as the tribal percussions, the orchestral elements, and the Middle Eastern melodies, while still maintaining its own identity. However, this adaptation has a ton of issues, the most notable one being the production values. A budget of $20 million for 3 episodes means that they most likely spent $6 to $7 million per episode. And as a result, the costumes, the set designs, the visual effects all reek of cheapness, even as products of their time. So the overall production value ranges, in my opinion, between a school play and a high-budgeted fan film. Because this is a much longer experience than the David Lynch film, as it's trying to adapt as much from the book as possible, it's going to be tedious in spots. And if you somehow end up stumbling upon the director's cut, which has an extra 30 minutes, well, good luck getting through that. You know, I would have preferred 5 or 6 shorter episodes, but they had a budget to work with, so I don't blame them. The acting is also occasionally wobbly, not to mention this one particular scene in the last episode.
The guild does not take your orders. Tell them to look into the future.
And there was some creative liberties that I wasn't totally on board with. The only one I can mention is the casting of, yet again, an adult in the role of Paul Atreides. So overall, this was yet another adaptation of Dune that just ended up being okay, in my opinion. And I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. So this brings us to the most recent adaptation of Dune, that being the 2021 film, which covers roughly the first half of the book. It was produced by Legendary Pictures and distributed by Warner Bros. Pictures. Denis Villeneuve sat behind the camera for this one. You may recognize him for directing films like Prisoners, Sicario, Arrival, and Blade Runner 2049. Now, when compared to prior adaptations, as well as roughly the first half of the book, this film was incredible for so many reasons. For starters, the casting choices were all perfect. You've got Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides, Zendaya as Shani, Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica, Oscar Isaac as Duke Leto Atreides, Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck, Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho, Javier Bardem as Stilgar, Stellan Skarsgård as Vladimir Harkonnen, Dave Bautista as Raban, and the list goes on. The visual effects are not only dazzling to look at, especially the sandworms, but they are easily the best as far as Dune adaptations go. The action scenes are beautifully filmed and choreographed, without a single trace of shaky cam or jump cuts in sight. The score by Hans Zimmer has this otherworldly desert vibe to it, and heavily utilizes female choirs, strings, percussions, and wind instruments. And there's even an additional score known as the Dune Sketchbook, which you can find on YouTube. Plus, the film is incredibly faithful to the source material, with a few minor creative liberties being taken here and there. The most notable one being Dr. Kynes' gender swap. The film isn't perfect, however. You know, with its runtime of about 155 minutes, it can be a bit exhausting, especially in a single viewing. And the note that they chose to leave the movie on was kind of odd, and it was something that I was actually expecting to see in Dune Part 2. But nonetheless, I loved this particular adaptation, and I'm so glad I had the pleasure of seeing this in theaters. So I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So yeah, those are my thoughts on each adaptation of Dune. Next time I'm going to be reviewing Dune Part 2, so look forward to that very soon. Thank you all for watching, guys. Please be sure to like the video, share it, and subscribe. Ring the bell. Take care, and I'll see you soon.